first Inspiratia Fueling the Energy Transition webinar. My name is Charlie Osborne, and I'm a director here at the Energy Transition Specialists. Today, it's great to get back to my roots, though, and to talk about the role commodities and natural resources can play to facilitate the energy transition. It's great to be joined here today by the following experts across the trade, commodity, and project finance space. So we have Guy Desai, Managing Director and Head, Energy Transition and Natural Resources at CIBC. We have Alex Peters, CFO from Torq Commodities. And we have Orhan Güneş, Founder and Managing Director, Tradeqraft. And finally, we have Tom Papworth, Senior Associate at Herbert Freehills. Thank you and welcome to everyone. So yeah, the energy transition is most definitely at the forefront of the renewables agenda, with even non-traditional players making their mark. Being green is most definitely now a necessity, and even highly polluting industries such as steel and cement players are looking for ways to decarbonise, and this is in the development of crucial industry technologies such as hydrogen, carbon capture, and battery storage. However, securing a reliable, cost-effective and sustainable supply chain has become more challenging in the midst of the growing transition. And this first webinar will actually have a particular focus on critical minerals and what's needed from there. So I think just very generally to start, what is essentially needed from the raw materials and critical minerals side to fulfill the energy transition, and how can you make a nascent market marry up with one so volatile? Guy, if we can start with you, with your expertise across commodities and project finance, that would be great.
Yeah, happy to do that, Charlie. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here this afternoon. So, I mean, in terms of the question, what is needed from the raw materials world to meet or fulfill the energy transition? I think there are three parts to that sort of question, or the answer should be divided into at least three parts, if not more. I think the first is that we require the ecosystem which currently exists and which is principally made up of the following key stakeholders, being governments, federal, state, local, supra, regulators, mining companies, processing companies, refiners, etc., manufacturers of the end products, whether those be materials, components, products for a decarbonized economy like EVs and batteries, investors, lenders, ECAs, part of that lending cohort, multilaterals, etc., and critically, the end users and consumers all coming together and really shifting, all coming together and actually thinking about their own requirements, their relationships, and their arrangements in the context of a very shifting environment. So the paradigm has changed completely, the landscape has changed, and the old supply-demand balances that existed and the old contractual structures and relationships which supported those supply-demand balances have completely changed. And so the first thing that I would highlight is that we require an ecosystem which is adaptable, which is flexible, and which is willing to embrace the change which is required. And all of those participants and stakeholders play a role in that, a very important role. Secondly, and self-evidently, we require availability of critical minerals, and we require those minerals to be available at the right price, and ideally, helpfully, at a predictable price. And I'm sure others will talk about price in their own roles and participation in this webinar. So availability and price are critical. And that is because, as I said earlier, there is a real step change in the requirement, the quantities of critical minerals that are required to decarbonize the real economy, and in particular to transform the energy system from fossil fuel dependency to a decarbonized energy efficient system ready for the new, effectively to support the new markets. For that, we need vast quantities of copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and of course the rare earth elements as well. And for batteries in particular, lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite being crucial, as well as some manganese. To give you a bit of an idea, by 2050, the production of battery minerals will have or should have increased by 500% in order to meet net zero commitments across energy storage systems and electric vehicles principally. And by 2040, the energy sector will make up about 90% of the demand for lithium, largely because of the EV and energy storage drivers. So to produce solar panels, to produce offshore, onshore wind farms, to produce EVs, to produce batteries, to produce electrolyzers, to produce hydrogen, all of those things require raw materials and critical minerals in particular. So we need them in quantity. And what that means, that availability has to be broken down into the key areas that we're going to discuss in this webinar. Firstly, supportive policy and incentives on both sides of the line, as it were, for supply and demand, clear regulation, including environmental requirements and so on for the upstream piece, permitting and planning effectively. We need more mines to be developed, which we'll talk about. We need some innovation, because actually not all of our requirements will be met from extraction. Some of those will be met from new technologies, which evolve the way we produce these critical minerals and materials. We'll need the IP to actually refine these and process these, and we need that to be centered outside of where it currently is. It's very concentrated in Asia. We need that to move. And we need trusted relationships. That geopolitical aspect that we're going to discuss is hugely important as well. And finally, we probably need, to mention effectively sustainable and responsible development and ethics around all of this to work appropriately in the new investment environment. And investment is the third and key area. So the first being ecosystem and galvanization of stakeholders, the second being availability, security of supply, and how we make that happen through all the challenges that I've put forward. And then thirdly, funding, both investment from equity and leverage into the system to be able to support the upstream, to support the midstream, and to support the downstream end usage of these products that depend on those raw materials. And perhaps as part of a second question, I'll get into that feedstock dynamic. But to answer your question in short, to marry up what is required, as I've outlined, to the variance and the nascency of the markets that we're seeing in some of these decarbonized sectors, we require a very, very strong feedstock strategy for the projects that are coming forward. And for that, we can build in some things which are softer around effectively thinking about track record, supply demand dynamics, leverage and market position, but also things like vertical integration plays and contractual and downside protections, such as put or pay, guarantee, minimum volume guarantee obligations, price protection, sweeps, that sort of stuff. So I'm sure we'll come to all of that, but hopefully that gives you an idea across those three categories.
No, thank you very much, Guy. That's a great start to this. I think over the last few years, there's been so many different publications about the availability. I think that's a very good point. With some schools of thought that there is not enough, and there's some that there is. I think the personal opinion really is that there most definitely is. It's about how we get it out of the ground, and as you said, in a sustainable and ethical way. So yes, we will drill down into that. In fact, a very good stat that I found, and it actually came from Herbert Smith Freehills. So we're in good company with Tom on the panel here. So the stat that HSF put into their presentation was, according to the Minerals Council of Australia, more than 260 new lithium, cobalt, nickel and copper mines will be needed by 2030 if the world is to meet global demand for mineral intensive battery vehicles and energy storage batteries. So very similar to one that you brought up, Guy, there. But Tom, if we can bring this on to you now. I mean, is this even possible with what you're seeing?
I think just echoing some of the themes that Guy touched on just now, I think absolutely we will need more upstream activity. We will need to dig more mines to produce the critical minerals that are needed to support the energy transition. And what that means, of course, is that we will need to look at parts of the world, regions that perhaps have not traditionally been viewed as mining regions. Europe, for example, is getting more and more attention. There are some proponents in the industry who think we should be looking away from land-based mining to exploring possibilities of deep sea mining the seabed, which remains very nascent and for some controversial. we also need to be thinking about it's not just more mines, but how are we mining? You know, we need to be finding more innovative ways to extract the metals and minerals from the material that we've found. I mean, a great example of this is something like direct lithium extraction, which involves extracting lithium compounds from geothermal waters rather than hard rock mining. And a couple of great trailblazers of this technology are Cornish Lithium in the UK and Vulcan Energy in Germany that are doing exactly that. How can we, you know, enhance our recovery rates from lower grade ores, given that ore grades are declining in quality as we go? How can we utilize waste in a more effective way? But you know, developing so many new mines and increasing, you know, upstream capacity in such a short space of time, of course, is incredibly challenging. And perhaps we can touch on some of the main challenges later in the conversation. But I think, as Guy said, just doing more mining is not the full story. It's far too simplistic. I think we also need to be thinking about increasing processing and refining capacity. As Guy said, you know, before they're fit for end use, critical minerals need to be processed and refined. So it's really essential that we have that refining capacity in place. The geographical concentration of, you know, the critical minerals world is highly concentrated at the upstream end, but it's even more so at the capacity at the processing end, with China in particular pretty much controlling the market of refining certain critical minerals. So that's one area we need to look at. We need to be looking at recycling, manufacturing. In short, we need to look at how the whole supply chain fits together and how the various sections interact. Now, the problem is in Europe, we produce a very small proportion at the moment of the world's critical minerals, and we're reliant on third countries to produce our critical mineral needs, which is the outcome of decades of policy decisions whereby we've, you know, effectively outsourced our critical minerals needs to third countries. However, we really are now at an inflection point where governments and businesses have woken up to the urgency of the situation and the scale of the challenge when it comes to sourcing critical minerals. And again, I think what Guy was echoing, I think, you know, we need to implement a robust regulatory framework covering the whole of the critical minerals supply chain. And I can talk further about the patchwork of legislation that's proliferating in Europe at the moment. We need a huge amount of public and private investment in the sector. And I think there's also a wider education piece as well. I think the wider public needs to understand the vital role that critical minerals play in supporting the energy transition. And there's a kind of a rebranding and myth debunking exercise in some ways for the mining industry and making sure that happens. I think that's enough at this stage, and perhaps we can continue some of those themes later in the discussion.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that, Tom. Again, very thorough, and I think it's also a very salient point looking at what's needed once you find the mines, because I think I was speaking to someone the other week about, you know, the length of time it kind of takes from junior mines to inception to exploration, and it's such a huge amount of time. And I think I just wonder if there's some sort of innovation that can be done around then. We also at Inspiration, we covered recently the Indonesian nickel export ban. Obviously, there's one of many countries banning exports at the moment. You mentioned China having a bit of a grip of the market, I think, at the moment. So I just wonder what kind of squeeze that will have on the need for other mines elsewhere, whether there'll be even more of a squeeze on lithium-ion batteries to be sourced over sort of NMC. So some very interesting kind of food for thought there. Thank you very much. I think that just moving now onto the pricing of the metals. Is this possibly aligning with demand? Alex, if I can move on to you, it would be great to kind of get your trading expertise on this.
Yes, thank you very much, Charlie. Pleasure being here, and contribute, to the session. So we have pretty much spoken, in induction about the underinvestment in the mining sector and for critical minerals, and also, the need, to ramp up production, refining capacity, et cetera. But if you look at currently the market fundamentals, they're showing, a slightly different picture, because from a peak level, nickel has dropped 60% downwards trajectory in terms of prices, lithium 80%, copper 65%. Based on a study published by Goldman Sachs, until year end, we're expecting additional price softening. So in the region of 12% for nickel, 15% for lithium, and 25% for copper. That's a little bit in opposition to what just stated before, because in an environment, where there are strong, demand factors, you governing, the supply chain equation, one would expect, the only ways up, but the trends are showing some completely different picture, as I already mentioned. Why is that so? Currently, we are facing, regardless of these facts, in the longer term view, we are facing an oversupply of critical battery metals to the industry. So that brings pretty much another equation to that, because when we speak about critical battery metals and minerals, we are thinking immediately about ESG requirements, carbon footprint, and everything that's related to environmental, social, and governance aspects. So that brings specifically, if you bring into light the overproduction and overperformance of the Indonesian nickel market, brings a discussion that traders have now these days. What should be the price for green nickel and what should be the price for so-called dirty nickel? So when you say dirty nickel, what we mean by that is pretty much you have coal-fired smelters, which don't take, renewable energy into account, which have a strong, carbon footprint, polluted wastewaters, and there are also, in certain regions, also social aspects, as part of the ESG governance. So the question is, that all traders are now actively discussing also, with the LME and other exchanges, should there be a premium for green nickel versus the dirty option of the nickel, how the market is called that. And because otherwise, you are not competing, on a level playing field, because you have economies who have high regard of ESG and others who technically even are eliminating, the word ESG, out of the equation, and not monitoring, this aspect. So that's one of the crucial criteria, because if you have a very strong ESG arbitrage across the sector, it's rather obvious that the mining sector, who is not so ESG aware, to put it that way, will over time, outperform the others. And this is pretty much what's on the radar. If you look, the likes of Indonesia is expected by 2029 to produce 2/3, of LME prime nickel. So if we factor in also the ESG components into the equation, this summer, where you see that other jurisdictions like Australia, Canada, and other jurisdictions that I didn't mention so far have a high degree of ESG awareness and are really pretty much into carbon accounting, carbon tracking, and delivering their contribution to net zero. And that's actually a factor that needs to be regarded. So should be introduced a sort of a bonus malus system for CO2. We know that from carbon emissions, which will also part of this panel, is there is a price for the emissions you have to pay, and there also needs to be a metrics and regulatory environment reinforced and strengthened, as Tom already mentioned in his contribution, is regulatory aspect which will lead to a fair pricing, because why should there be a disadvantage for ESG aware miners in opposition to others which are more concerned at the low cost production and also ramping up their volumes across the sector.
No, thank you very much for that, Alex. And I think that's interesting in terms of the points about premium metal pricing. I think there is going to be a lot of that kind of passing the cost down along the supply chain. We've already seen, I think we've covered a lot on green steel, for example, and really the cost is getting passed. There's a real view that with car manufacturers that there's a consumer base out there that want more of their car to be made with kind of ethically sourced or ethically produced steel. So I think there's going to be quite a bit of that, and it's very interesting. And an incredible stat: about 2/3 of Indonesian nickel to be for the LME grade nickel, I think is quite an incredible stat. Orhan, have you got any kind of thoughts that you'd like to add? And perhaps you could also touch upon some of the funding sources actually for some of this. That would be great.
Sure, with pleasure. First of all, thanks to everyone before me who gave a very comprehensive outlook about everything I wanted to say. But I would like to add on a couple of points Alex mentioned. I think especially how we price and incentivize the green products in the industry and what kind of methodology we are using is a crucial point. Because what we don't want in the market is the ones producing or providing green products and helping the energy transition in a, let's say, a stronger scale should not be singled out from the market. I mean, they should be rewarded correctly, and that reward should be a fair reward, basically. There's a lot of work on this, but I would like to give a little bit comprehensive outlook from my point of view. First of all, copper, cobalt, nickel, and lithium producers' revenues will increase fourfolds in the next 2 decades. So this means like cumulative trade of these 4 commodities will reach to $13 trillion, which is equal to, I mean, this is between 2022 until 2040. Therefore, it will be same as oil. So what we talk about right now, oil market will be equalized with these 4 commodities extensively utilized. And when we talk about energy transition, we always look from the industrial energy utilization, consumption, as well as EVs. But as I mentioned in between our talks, semiconductors and chip industry is also very important, and it has a massive influence on geopolitics as well as pricing of these significant and rare metals in the industry. I mean, as an example, like, in 2021, imported chips in EU worth 51 billion euros. And this is backbone of the chip industry and rare earth metals, as well as raw materials utilized in this. And European Commission recently identified 34 strategic raw materials. Those are including beryllium, gallium, germanium, indium, magnesium, metallic silicon, and the other rare earths within these 34 strategic products. So these production, I mean, if you look at the market dynamics in the long run, it is quite cheerful outlook what we see. But in the short run, as Alex pointed out, there's a lot of drama due to the price slides, what we have seen, because copper supply is expected to increase 20% over the next decade. And same for the cobalt and graphite. Actually, they are going to increase, they are going to be tripled, and lithium quintupled 4 times. And under these scenarios, the prices should keep up with that. But in the short term, we see a different picture than the long term. This is why I would like to look at the long-term view of how we fund these and how we invest, and also short-term commodity finance, let's say up to 2 to 3 years, how we look at that, because these dynamics are completely different. When we look at the long term, I mean, what we see on the mining projects is lithium of cobalt like half a decade, and the others like a decade of investment is required. But most of our investment view is like 5 to 7 years maximum. So therefore, there's a dichotomy what we see from the lenders and the traders or the producers' point of view. Then I would like to switch to another important point, which is geopolitical tensions on the pricing of metals. Because if you look at the single product exports from Bolivia for lithium, DRC for cobalt, Peru for copper, we see a lot of different geopolitical dynamics which impacts the pricing of these metals, coupled with long-term investment and short-term funding of these projects, including prepayment to up to receivable financing for repaying the products exported from these countries. So this is one complicating factor, and I don't have the answer for that, to be honest. And the metals and minerals producers also, I think Thomas mentioned about how we can reform the practices on the budgeting practices and how we mitigate the exposures on short-term, mid-term, and long-term. I think we also need to prepare ourselves from the producer's point of view, how they budget themselves and how they prepare for the especially long-term outlook. Then we come to Alex's point about volatile commodity prices and how we hedge them, and how to make the industry more stringent to this volatility. I think the good, capable traders can manage this risk much better, and their implication on the short-term prices and their like basic trading activity gets much more successful in that regard. And the last point is measures to be taken for the reduced potential on the labor market displacements, because this is also an important input on the production. And we see a lot of displacements on this regard on the high value labor and the low value labor, especially in Africa. I think there's a lot of displacement what we see, and World Trade Organization have papers about that, and I'm not sure there's a let's say uniform solution on all these different geographies. And the last point is exchange rates. De-dollarization of our industry is still continuing, and more different currencies taken into the picture on the investments and trades. And I think exchange rates will play a major role in the future. My last point is modernizing the mining regulations. I think it's mentioned before me, but that's important for the economic development and net zero targets. And it's often overlooked, but I think that is one of the prominent pillars of favorable funding costs in the industry.
No, thank you very much, Orhan. And I think, yeah, again, mentioning some points about some of the geopolitical issues around some of the mining locations, I think is very applicable in this. And I just think it's a wonderful balancing act, I think, at the moment that I think the industry is looking to do. Guy, do you have anything that you could potentially add on this? I mean, from your point of view, what are some of the challenges faced when when financing some of these projects, and particularly in regions that are perhaps quite tricky?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, our focus has really not necessarily been financing directly upstream greenfield production, if you like, but a combination of looking at some of that and together with the downstream utilization and build out of the value chain. So in particular, my focus over the last year has been around the battery space and the electric vehicle space, and a couple of interesting things to just pick up on in terms of what Alex, Orhan and others have said. I think in terms of lithium prices and nickel and copper as well, quite frankly, over the last year, we have seen oversupply and price compression as a result of that oversupply, but largely, at least for lithium and nickel, a lot of that has been caused by EV uptake slowdown. And we have seen effectively that desire to pass on costs through to the consumer in terms of when there was tightness in supply and therefore prices were high, being resisted in tandem with the fact that policy around EV is diluted slightly, and cost of living crisis in Europe in particular in the maturer markets has impacted EV uptake. So there's been that slowdown, which has actually led to a bit of coincidence of oversupply caused by lack of demand, but also caused by new supply coming on due to the anticipation of net zero requirements driving increased demand. And I think that we'll see that settle. So to the Goldman piece that Alex was talking about, I think by the midpoint of the decade and beyond, we do hope to see those effects around oversupply abating and effectively supply and then being balanced out by increased electrification and demand on the other side, working in tandem. But I think the key point with critical minerals and raw materials in general and commodity is that one doesn't know, and they are subject to many different factors, the price and the availability of these commodities. To go back to the question around financing and what we look for, I think as a project financier, we obviously look for price certainty and revenue certainty. So at the front end, we're looking for availability of supply being secure, which is why I was talking about minimum contracted tonnages or volumes, guarantees and so forth, put or pay, those sorts of dynamics. We're looking for tenor of contracts being of an adequate duration. That is challenging, to Orhan's point. The depth of the markets don't really exist. So forward contracts are 1 to 2 to 3 years max. And then we're talking about accessing spot markets or talking about renewals of contracts. So tenor and minimum tenor requirement is an area of diligence and scrutinization. And then, of course, price, how we can manage price volatility. Obviously, through the contract day one hopes for pass-through to the extent possible of metals which are traded and have track record and depth in their markets. But where in the case of lithium and cobalt, for example, there isn't that depth, we're starting to see some traded markets. We, in fact, have a desk that is now set up around cobalt and lithium, but these don't have the depth and the look-forward curves that we would see in the other commodities, and that is a challenge. So the way we deal with that is really thinking about structural mechanics within the financing documents to protect the lenders. So we take the percentage which is passed through and look at that on a cost-certain basis, and we look at the variable elements or the downside cases and seek to protect them through mechanics built in, so things like forward-looking tests, sweeps, etc., enhanced reporting, renewal mechanics that need to be in place to create a rolling obligation to renew a certain number of months before expiry of the contract. We look forward and look at the diversity of suppliers in the market through market due diligence. We look at the ability of the end user to effectively diversify its supply through leverage and building critical mass and scale of its own. And importantly, and one thing we haven't really touched on in any depth, is we look at vertical integration plays and also recycling. So the ability of that end user to control the entire value chain, both to control some of those geopolitical elements that we talked about, the uncertainty around sourcing, the ability to make sure that, tensions or trade agreements which may ebb and flow don't impact the security of supply, but also to create for themselves a bit of security around the price as well. So I think vertical integration, we're increasingly seeing downstream players go into the processing and the production parts of the value chain. And I do think that we are going to see far more recycling, particularly driven by regulation in the EU and other places around minimum content in terms of batteries in particular. Final point that I'd just make is around the geopolitical part and the protectionism. I don't know if people read this morning in the FT, there was a piece around EV manufacturing and some talk from Mercedes, Stellantis, etc., some contrary positions coming through, where Mercedes and the CEO were talking about the sort of the desire not to foster increased protectionism in these markets, but to allow the open market to dictate how trade flows and how materials flow, and to encourage an organic, if you like, improvement through regulation, which is globally applicable, to drive higher ESG standards across the piece. In contrast to perhaps the position of some of our other OEMs who wish to see more regulation, which creates more stringent requirements and may lead to more protective measures on the part of China, etc., in terms of export controls and so on and so forth. So I think there's a real point in the market of interest here where we're seeing different drivers. And as things play out, this is a very fluid situation. So this will impact price and this will impact, obviously, availability as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's something to consider as well. I think just the intricacies in terms of financing some of these projects. I don't think people anticipate just how much it is, and certainly over the last few years, how much they've increased. So no, that's some very, very good points there. Thank you. You mentioned a little bit about the regulation and the changing of that. So I'm quite interested to hear about how is the regulatory landscape for critical minerals changing, and how do such regulatory changes drive behaviours? If I could open that to the group, perhaps.
So I could maybe start. I mean, over the past few years, there's been a real proliferation of new policies and legislation, certainly in Europe, but in the West more generally, that affect the critical minerals supply chain. What the result of that in Europe is effectively a patchwork now of overlapping legislation that seeks to address effectively a trichotomy of issues, being one, security of supply of critical minerals, two, addressing climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and three, encouraging responsible mining practices. And Orhan touched on one of the kind of the flagship EU pieces of legislation, which is the Critical Raw Materials Act, which is due to come into force pretty much imminently once it's formally adopted by the European Council and Parliament. And what the aim of that act is to ensure a secure, diversified, affordable, and sustainable supply of critical raw materials. It, as we've heard, it identifies 30-odd critical raw materials which are seen as fundamental to the functioning of the EU economy, of which there's a smaller subset of what's known as strategic minerals, which are of particular importance because of the geopolitical context, supply chain disruption, etc. And one of the main things that the Act does is it sets a number of targets for the European Union, which is for it to extract 10% of its annual consumption of critical minerals, to process 40% of its annual consumption, to recycle 15%, and also not be dependent on any one particular country for more than 65% of its critical minerals used. And in order to kind of encourage projects within Europe, it provides for a more streamlined permitting process and supported access to finance. Although importantly, it doesn't actually provide direct financial incentives or state funding. It also has a number of ESG requirements and a framework for international partnerships with third countries. That is one aspect of that kind of trichotomy that I talked about earlier, mainly focusing on the security of supply aspect, but there's also things that other panelists have talked about today, the batteries regulation that imposes supply chain due diligence on OEMs and other industry players. There's that came into force last year. There's the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, which is due to come into force shortly, which again will require industry players to look both upstream and downstream in the supply chain, and monitor ESG compliance. You talked about kind of regulatory changes driving behaviors. I think that within this patchwork of legislation, there are push factors and there are pull factors. The obvious push factors being, for your OEMs, the risk of non-compliance being potential fines, civil liability, reputational damage. But there are real pull factors, for investors thinking about mining and processing projects in Europe. The idea of faster permitting, financial incentives, is a real pull. But we'll see, whether the regulatory framework that's been put in place has what it needs to meet those targets.
May I say a couple of words, if you don't mind?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, sure. I think Thomas touched all the points I wanted to mention again, but a couple of words, like in the historical perspective from Kyoto, Paris summits, like till the patchwork of policies within mainly in EU. Because what all these supranational institutions and governments try to do is to adopt a uniform policy for net zero for 2035 to 2050. That is achieved. That's fine, perfect. Like that is there, but there is no uniform incentives in regulations, and there is no uniform approach on the, again, long-term and short-term funding needs, which takes into the picture the ECAs, banks, international banks, supranational banks, regional banks, and export agencies. So this is what we see as a major challenge on this side. The second point is these projects at the end lead to first healthy and ESG compliant procedures, less pollution, and the third thing is less energy costs, right? I mean, if they cannot achieve this, which we couldn't achieve so far, I mean, collectively, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So these incentives, eventually, market should kind of like balance itself, and it should lead to less pollution, healthy and secure practices from mining to production, as well as production of any materials which is utilized in this energy transition process. And for sure, we need to make sure that energy prices are getting cheaper. So so far we have achieved, I think, 2 out of 3, but the first one is quite crucial. And again, everything boils down to geopolitical problems. I mean, I think that will resolve everything. And coming back to Guy's point, I think when she opened the topic, we are working in a landscape or ecosystem dependent on each other. And our success is dependent how we can work together and make it efficient. And the degree and magnitude of this efficiency will make positive, basically, outcomes for everyone. So our challenge is how we work together.
I would like also to add a few comments to that. Fully agree to that. What the panel is saying. I still think there is still a lot of ESG arbitrage across the board. Too much sovereign government intervention on one side and a few. So if we are competing in a global landscape, if we reflect on the EV production figures, China and rest of the world, we all can agree, that China is pretty much the production and export champion. That so uniform legislation and regulation will create a level playing field. It's really no use, to make a robust, framework in Europe, but then other jurisdictions are not affected to that. So in certain countries, even in the US, in certain sovereign states, you're not even allowed, to quote ESG, as a category. So a uniform approach, and also, a fair pricing mechanism. Green should be priced properly, and equally dirty product should be priced or penalized properly to create a level playing field. I mean, even, we were speaking also, about carbon credits. That's just also a reflection a little bit of the asymmetries in the market, because, the cost of carbon credits is not equally a uniform price, across the world. So in certain jurisdictions, which are higher polluting countries, they're even, more cost efficient than in Europe. So legislation is there to step in all the way to one day, and this is already part of the debate, having literally for every electric vehicle a passport. Where does it come from? What kind of materials have in mind? And it has an ESG certificate, which will be also priced accordingly, also, on a premium discount system, to have a fair reflection of the investment of the economy into meeting net zero standards, and also contributing, to the stopping, the climate change. And all of these components, in essence, will lead to specifically, to what guys said on the banking sector. We know how banks are looking, at performance, how are looking, on the longer term view on pricing mechanism. So a fair regulatory legislation landscape will also create, a higher degree of price predictability. Also, what Orhan mentioned in his contribution, hedging instruments, and we don't have sufficient time to go into that. What kind of, specifically on the nickel, cobalt, what's the main contract, what's the prime quality, but what are, the kind of derivatives like sulfates? They cannot be priced the same way. And these are still mechanisms that need to be introduced. And then also, with a view, speaking about nickel, it's also managing the ESG component. It's very difficult, because on one side, the LME has to solve the liquidity, of the nickel contract. On the other side, now introducing, ESG components to that would be detriment, to that development. So again, these are regulatory things that need to take into account, but with a global view, not a regional, that you have silos frameworks, for every continent or every jurisdiction, but really have a global view on that, and have a uniform view on the performance of the industry.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you everyone on that. I think it's very interesting talking about the different regulations that exist in what is essentially still very voluntary at the moment. I think so. It's how do they marry up against one another's different regions, different regulatory frameworks, and perhaps we can drill down just for the last point. Just looking at, I'd be quite interested to hear some of the vulnerabilities in the existing critical mineral supply chain, perhaps just to end this one. What are some of these vulnerabilities that we're seeing at the moment?
I think we've in the various discussions touched on a number of them. I think we talked at length about price volatility, long project lead times. Depending on the project, that can be 15 years plus. I think in certainly in the upstream market, there can be a lack of infrastructure, such as things like railways, ports, power generation, in particular in emerging markets. If you're looking to develop a new project, I think one important area that applies to both upstream and midstream is ultimately long-term demand and changes in technology. Charlie, you talked about the kind of the shift in battery and cathode technology from, you know, kind of NMC based, you know, nickel, manganese, cobalt cathodes to kind of lower or no cobalt alternatives like lithium, iron phosphate cathodes. And, you know, we're also seeing things like sodium ion batteries, solid state batteries, and you know, to make an investment decision about you know, for a technology that may be redundant in 10-15 years time can be a difficult one. We talked about political insecurity. You know, provenance for investors is an important one in terms of you know, particular high risk conflict ridden jurisdictions. We talked about resource nationalism as well. So they can be some of the probably my key points.
I could also add another point to that. You know, if we take look at most of the mining is done, you know, in Africa. So most of the regions in Africa, you know, they have a severe US dollar crunch. You know, it fits into a lot of discussion that were already taken, you know, in this panel, starting from de-dollarization on one side, then what Orhan mentioned, FX will become more and more relevant because there are already certain moves, you know, into de-dollarization, you know, of the mining sector. On the other side, even in dollar terms, there is a dollar crunch in terms of export controls, currency controls in certain economies, which are still a very big hurdle, and it needs a, you know, a lot of firepower in order to manage that. You know, buying forward contracts, managing the volatility of the currency, hedging that. There is still a lack, you know, of proper hedging instruments for every currency in sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Africa, in general in the African continent. And it's not limited just to Africa. I'm just picking, you know, one of the most representative jurisdiction for that. So that's also, you know, what Orhan mentioned in his contribution is about stepping up, you know, of the regional banks, you know, providing this mechanism because they have the infrastructure of offering that, you know, to the local economies in the region equally on a global level.
Thank you. Orhan, Guy, any sort of last words on any of the complexities or, you know, are the newer technologies receiving the support that they need, do you think?
So I think, I mean, in terms of last word, I think the one area that we've discussed so much today, but I think the couple of areas that we haven't discussed is the value of all of these new value chains being developed across the globe, you know, to the global economy and to the localized and the communities that support these industries. And I think one of the other areas of great focus is where should that value reside? Should that be, you know, and there's no right answer to this, but obviously nations where the resources reside would like to take more of that value and keep it more for their local communities rather than exporting at source, if you like, the produced materials. So I think there'll be shifts in the sands in terms of, you know, the midstream or upstream elements of the value chain to reflect the fact that countries like Namibia, for example, don't just want to export their materials now, but they actually also want to process them and to work on the manufacturing side to actually produce the end products that are going to be utilized globally. So I think that that's important. In the more developed nations and economies, what we're seeing is obviously a huge drive to create green jobs and upskilling. And that also involves localization of supply chains and value in the broader value chain. So things like Cornish lithium were mentioned, Vulcan. We've never seen really substantial European mining in that sense before. That's quite interesting. We're seeing development of gigafactories in Europe. We're seeing the development of industrial clusters to support the processing of critical minerals to produce things like not just batteries, but also the different components required for decarbonisation. So I think, you know, there are a lot of challenges that we have discussed, but there's a lot of positives in terms of the growth of the real economy and the decarbonised economy, and how we effectively use these arbitrage opportunities that exist today and ultimately create that level playing field so that everyone can come to the party and benefit from the regeneration that the energy transition will bring, because it creates huge opportunity. I think we have to go through this slightly painful period for the next few years while things normalize, if you like, to the new normal. And it may take more than a few years, I might concede, but it's an exciting journey that we're on. Thanks.
I think maybe I can make one more word after all these good points. Very happy to discuss about very salient points about our industry, I think. Just to add guys' points, like about the global scale, the challenges what we have seen. I think definitely batteries and EV is getting like sufficient attention from everyone in the industry. And when we look at the EV sales in 2015, it was 1% overall. I mean, 1% of the overall sales. In 2022, it was 13%. So I think, I mean, everyone is like putting a lot of attention on that. But hydrogen, or as I mentioned earlier, chip and semiconductors industries, rare earth needs, and those are a bit maybe overlooked in terms of investments, horizon, funding, as well as hedging. So these are, I think, critical points where, again, alignment and comprehensive outlook from producers or traders' point of view, if they are well prepared, if they put their strategies in a conscious, sustainable, and yeah, I mean, well-trimmed level, I think they will be much more successful. But for that, again, we need to create uniform rules and regulations, which will be quite critical. And then we come to the point that how we make sure and how we can contribute. I think every one of us, like, we are going through a historical transition point where we can voluntarily, that's my positive outlook. Maybe I'm over optimistic, but but we should voluntarily put certain efforts in order to enable this period. And I think all the participants, thanks to your contributions on all the points we discussed, but I think we have a good point is like we have enough voluntary efforts in the market. That's a positive point of view, I hope.
No, nice positive way to end, I think, which is very good. So thank you, Orhan. Thank you everyone as well for all of these excellent points. Guy, I think you said it. We've covered a lot today, but there's actually so much more we could talk about. I think so many things have got mentioned. Alex, you mentioned carbon credits. I've talked to clients about the impact of CBAM. Pressures on commodity traders to move into the renewables world. So for everyone listening, please do keep an eye out. These will be on the next webinars that we're doing. This is the first of many inspiratia webinars on the Fueling the Energy Transition series, and ending with a conference in Geneva during Geneva Commodities Week, which will be around November. So plenty of exciting topics to talk about. And we also want to hear from you as well. Anyone that's listening, please do reach out if you have any other points or questions, particularly for our expert panel. It remains for me to say thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to Alex, thank you to Guy, thank you to Orhan, and thank you to Tom very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us here.
Thank you.